Hi, I'm Arnie Skelton, and each week in this podcast series, I'm going to offer you my top 10 tips on particular topics or themes that might be of interest to you as a teacher or manager, or both. Hi, and welcome to this week's podcast, which I'm entitling Making and Breaking Commitments. A few weeks ago, I did a podcast on beating myself up, and it's received one or two very favourable comments because it was a little bit more personal than usual. So I thought I'd follow up this week with something else that has been quite a significant part of my life, which is about making and breaking commitments. So here we go, my top 10 tips on making and breaking commitments. Tip number 1 is to recognise that a commitment is not the same as being motivated. Being motivated, in a sense, relies on something else triggering your motivation. So it's a response to a wish, a drive, a vision, a desire, a circumstance. A commitment is something you personally can make, whatever your motivational state. It's a promise. It's an offer of guaranteeing to do something. So motivation and commitment are not the same thing. That's tip number 1. And what follows is tip number 2, that commitments then are easier to make than motivations. We can't really be motivated all the time. That's just not realistic. But it is possible to be committed all the time or permanently to something. So commitments, in a sense, are easier to make than being motivated. I can commit to studying something without necessarily being motivated in that study all the time. So commitments are easier, more available than motivation. Tip number 3. If you think about commitment, what is it we're committed to? And I think there are 3 things that are possibilities. You can be committed to something, to doing something, a task or an activity or a project. So that's one type of commitment. The second type of commitment is to be committed to someone. To make a commitment to someone else. And of course the third one is to make a commitment to yourself. To make a personal promise or guarantee to yourself. And all 3 do not necessarily work in the same direction, and that's the problem. So tip number 3, you can make 3 types of commitment: to something, to someone, or to yourself. And tip number 4 is starting to consider that tension. What if making those commitments to, say, someone conflicts with making a commitment to yourself? And that's where real tension and real struggles can arise. You may make a commitment, for example, in a marriage, to someone, but it isn't working out. And it isn't working out for things that matter to you. And if it's not working out to you, and yet you want to look after yourself, if your health or well-being is suffering, how do you reconcile making that commitment to your own well-being and at the same time honouring a commitment you have made to someone else? So tip number 4 is to recognise that there will be a struggle if there is 2 types of commitment that conflict. You've made a promise or a commitment to somebody, and it's not working well in terms of the commitments you feel you need to honour for yourself. And that leads to tip number 5, to recognise that there's 2 ways of interpreting that struggle. If you are concerned about your own well-being in terms of your commitment to yourself, and it's going to conflict and possibly break your commitment to someone else, then you might regard doing so as a very selfish act. You are putting your own needs ahead of those of someone else, your own commitment to yourself ahead of your commitment to someone else. But the other way of regarding that, of course, is to think about it in terms of self-care, that you do need to look after yourself. It is, after all, your life and your well-being. So consider whether, if you have that kind of struggle between being committed to yourself and committed to somebody else, whether in fact that commitment is selfish or self-care. So tip number 6 be careful then of making long-term commitments. Now, I don't want to make anyone over anxious about commitments to somebody else. It's part of our convention, part of our life, that we enter into marriage with people, and that is in effect a commitment. The marriage vow, for instance, that's a very strong form of commitment. But things change over time. We know that. We know that there's a high incidence of divorce, and that is one way, of course, of reconciling the difference between a commitment to someone and a commitment to someone else. And I suppose the simplest way of saying what I'm thinking is, it's easier to act in haste and repent in leisure, or it's easier to over-promise and under-deliver. So be very careful about long-term commitments to someone else. Be very sure, because it may, and I'm not saying it will, but it may rebound when you have to face this tension between a commitment you have made to somebody else, and you want to honour your word. It's very important to honour your word to people, but at the same time, it's very important to be able to look after yourself. So tip number 6 is just think very carefully before making a long-term commitment to someone else. Life, in a sense, is a movie, not a snapshot. It's easy to make a commitment, but if you have a strong belief in honouring your word, then it's going to be very difficult for you psychologically and emotionally to break that commitment once it's been made. And tip number 7, a commitment to something, to doing something which you make at a particular time, may over time be challenged by other priorities. At the point at which you make a commitment, that in that moment seems to be an easy thing to do, a priority, and sometimes it actually psychologically just feels good to offer your word, a promise, to somebody else. But that's the point about acting in haste and repenting in leisure. What's easy to do verbally can be hard to sustain through actions. So be careful not to make an instant commitment when, standing back and thinking about it, it might be a costly commitment to have made in the longer term. So priorities in life tend to change, and as they change, they may very much challenge earlier made commitments. So tip number 7 is to recognize that a commitment being made in the moment might not be a priority later down the track. And tip number 8 is to think about the relationship between commitment and integrity. Integrity is a very, very powerful value. Many people regard integrity as their number one self-valuing value, that they believe that making a commitment, keeping a promise, keeping your word is a major signifier of your own integrity. So if you make a commitment and then feel you cannot maintain it, you are in a sense challenging your own integrity, and that's a really, really strong feeling to feel that you are no longer acting with integrity. So there's a very strong relationship between commitment and integrity, and if you make a commitment that later on you feel you have to break, your own sense of worth and self-esteem will possibly suffer, because you're in effect letting down your own sense of integrity. So again, making a commitment that later down the track may not be easy to maintain or may not be helpful to maintain may cause a loss of self-esteem and self-respect, because it's challenging your own sense of integrity. Tip number 9. A commitment is something we make either verbally to somebody else or to something, or in our head, a kind of self-talk. We say, right, I'm going to be committed to that, I'm going to give it my best shot, I'm going to do that. And that's words. And we're quite comfortable saying we're committed to something. It's an easy thing to do, isn't it? To say, I am committed. That's 3 words, I am committed. It's an instant, easy fix. But actually you only demonstrate that you're committed through your actions, through deeds, not words. So be careful to express a feeling or a sentiment of commitment which actually cannot be delivered through action. So commitment's a really good example of where it's easier to say you're committed, perhaps, than it is to deliver that commitment. So that's the difference between saying you're committed and acting in a committed way. So tip number 9, recognize that true commitment follows through with deeds, not words. And final tip, tip number 10. It's about the scope of commitment and the definition of what you're committed to. It's easier to stay committed if your commitment is of a generalized, broader type. For example, if you say you are committed to helping most people most of the time, that's reasonably easy to deliver. If you say, I am going to help person X be happy and content all of the time, that's a really difficult commitment to be able to deliver. It's too specific, too personalized, too long term. So be careful about the framework of your commitment. The more specific and personal it is, the harder it may be to sustain over time. So whenever you frame a commitment, particularly to someone else, consider how realistic it will be in the fullness of life to deliver the commitment that you feel like making just now. So the broader the commitment, possibly the easier it will be to maintain. So that's it. Those are my top 10 tips on making and breaking commitments. Just to run through them quickly again. Tip number 1, commitment is not the same as motivation. Tip number 2, commitment is easier to own and therefore, in a sense, inherently to deliver because you own it. Tip number 3, there are 3 types of commitment: to something, to someone, or to yourself. Tip number 4, the hardest commitment to make and break is when you've made it to someone else, especially if it conflicts with a commitment to yourself. Tip number 5, the temptation is to see and resolve that conflict as being selfish, so you, if you like, prioritize your commitment to someone else at your own expense, because not to do so would be selfish, but in fact you have to consider whether it's less about being selfish and more about self-care and well-being. So reconcile the difference between selfish and self-care. Tip number 6, be careful that commitment has to be sustained over the longer term, and a commitment made now in the moment may not be easy to sustain over the longer term. Life is a movie and not a snapshot. Tip number 7, when you make a commitment, it feels like a priority, and it's an easy priority to give, but in fact over time other priorities might emerge that challenge that commitment. So understand that as life moves forward, your priorities will change, and that might challenge an earlier made commitment. Tip number 8 is there is a strong association between commitment and integrity, and it's quite difficult to let go of a commitment without it challenging your sense of self-worth and self-esteem in terms of your integrity. Tip number 9, remember that a commitment is easier to speak of, to say, to make verbally, but the truth of a commitment is in your actions, your deeds, whether you can deliver on that commitment. And tip number 10, the broader the commitment you make, perhaps the easier it is to sustain over the long term. So that's it, my top 10 tips on making and breaking commitments. I hope that was helpful for someone, and thanks for listening. Bye for now. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe. You will still get the podcast for free, but you will also get an alert to let you know when the next podcast is available. And please recommend the podcast to anyone else you think might like it and benefit from it. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review and any other comment, because they'll help promote the podcast series on the relevant platform. So, bye for now.